Jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli.
Wyjątkowo tajemniczy
An
marszałek
extremely
Sikorski
mysterious
przed lawiną
man,
pytań
Sikorski,
stanie
the
się
parliamentary
obawą
speaker,
dziennikarza, chcieli
cannot
dowiedzieć
repel
się,
the
co
avalanche of
Radosław
questions
Sikorski
as the
miał na myśli,
journalist
mówiąc
tried
o
to
propozycji rozbióru
specify
Ukrainy.
what
Władimir
Radosław
Putin miał
Sikorski
złożyć
had in
Donaldowi
mind when
Tuskowi
mentioning a proposal to have Ukraine partitioned. Such was allegedly Vladimir Putin's offer made to Donald Tusk. The Russian media are broadly commenting on the information disclosed by Mr. Sikorski.
pytań wszyscy się spodziewali.
For you are our enemy, our companion. Time for your questions. Everybody was expecting those very questions. Did you personally hear the proposal made to Donald Tusk by Vladimir Putin for Russia and Poland to jointly partition Ukraine? If not, then who told you about it? Has an official memo been made on the issue? Has the President of the Republic of Poland, our NATO and EU allies, been all notified of the affair? I could expect the question. Has a memo been made on the affair? Would you please read the text I've written? Do the Polish team have a record of the talk? What talk do you mean? Is there a memo? Would you please read my text, if there are no more questions? But sir, there are plenty of questions. Has there been any follow-up of that conversation, any memo that has been passed to the President and our allies? And what was your actual response as Minister of Foreign Affairs and that of Donald Tusk as Prime Minister? This is just an account that I overheard at some point. It might have been interpreted in one way, but its meaning has appeared to be different in the light of what happened meanwhile. For more on that, please refer to the text due to come out very soon. Thank you. Thank you very much. But you did speak to some papers. But Mr. Speaker, this press conference, as weird as it was, took place 6 years after Putin met with Tusk in Moscow. Radosław Sikorski, who took part in that meeting, was no more a foreign minister the moment the episode you've just seen occurred. He was the Speaker of the Sejm and tried to explain to the journalists, some of whom had joined him in Moscow, why the public opinion should only have learned so late about a conversation between Putin and Tusk, Poland's Premier and Russia's President, based on a press interview given by Sikorski. The journalists are asking the obvious questions, those talks being followed by any official documents, like, for example, a memo. Though repeatedly asked, Mr. Sikorski would never tell them with any official document from those talks that were produced. He gives no answer, although a few weeks earlier he personally rendered the document public. Sikorski's first press conference was such a disaster that he was forced to meet with the journalists on the same day once again. He said something different at the other press conference earlier on that day. He got utterly confused. I just wanted to cordially apologise to you, ladies and gentlemen, for the awkward situation that apparently occurred this morning. The fact that I cut my utterance short resulted from the pressure of time. Taught by the experience that unauthorised opinions tend to be so hugely misinterpreted, my intent was to offer you an authorised text. Well, one might at times go too far, and so it happened with me. So you were made aware of what you said about Ukraine based on an account. What account then? Whose? And how extensive was it? You know, I've made a firm decision only to report on what I've heard myself. Was it some sort of hearsay? How did you go about it then? As you aptly notice, I didn't take part in the conversation, so I obviously didn't inform on it. Did you have access to any notes or memos concerning the talks of the Polish delegation in Moscow, or had a chance to get acquainted? Having been misled by my own memory once, I'd rather avoid the mistake once again. But you certainly understand that nobody makes memos on grim jokes. Again, the journalists asked about the memos or other official documents. Mr. Sikorski said such affairs are not followed by a memo. Journalists have forgotten about the affair for years. We searched for those documents, and we did find them. I'm very glad that Mr. President in person and the other members of the Russian Federation's leadership team have so quickly read the indications that the intention of Poland, my own, and that of my government, is to improve on the Polish-Russian relations. Premier Donald Tusk's visit to Moscow appeared to be impressive, not only because Russia was one of the first countries to be visited by the new Polish Prime Minister, but primarily because of the way Polish diplomats had defined their objectives prior to the meeting. The documents drafted at the Foreign Ministry tell us that the primary and the major goal for the Polish diplomatic service and the head of the Polish government to tackle was to make a good impression with the Russian Federation as well as the European Union. The documents clearly state that the visit should be regarded successful if Russia as well as the EU jointly recognise that Poland has ceased to be an obstacle to the implementation of the common EU-Russian objectives. How should one understand the thus defined purpose of that particular visit and of the foreign policy as such? Krzysztof Szczerski, a professional diplomat and political scientist, comments on the matter. The whole set of the documents I have seen sum up ensue from the key decision that must have been made in Premier Tusk's circle, namely that our goal should be to put the best foot foremost and confirm to the West and to Moscow that Poland is quitting a policy of scepticism of what goes on at the Kremlin. Instead, it would now join the European mainstream and that it would build the deepening relations and contribute to Europe's dependencies on Russia. And then, there's just the consequences of entering such governmental policy path. We apparently have to gain confirmation from Moscow for our Western partners, expecting Moscow to state after such a visit that yes, Poland has already converted to the main European current. We, Russia, hereby confirm that such a turn has occurred.
Powie, tak, Polska się już nawróciła na główny europejski nurt. My, jako Rosja, potwierdzamy, że do takiej zmiany doszło.
From the perspective of the Russian Federation, the objectives were predefined much more specifically as they concerned the absolutely fundamental thing, the missile defense system. The Russians stated this directly. We can learn about it from the documents prepared and published at the Foreign Ministry after Donald Tusk's visit to Moscow. They namely said the decision as to the MDS had already been taken and, if implemented, the Russian Federation will target their missiles at Poland. We've made progress in certain matters, particularly as regards the degree of understanding of our points of view. Access to the oil from the Friendship Pipeline, the Muzheiki refinery, the so-called third ensign sailing and water transports on the Vistula Lagoon, the agreement on the visa-free local traffic along the border with Kaliningrad Oblast, and our position with respect to the EU's flexible visa policy towards Russian citizens. The discussion on these topics have shown that there is will and an opportunity to solve some of the problems that have been long awaiting a good scenario. We, moreover, agreed that the very fact that we have entered into talks with no prejudice whatsoever is quite promising as regards a strategic collaboration.
Dobrze rokuje na przyszłość, jeśli chodzi o strategiczną współpracę.
The points listed by Donald Tusk became later the subject of bilateral talks going on for years between representatives of Poland and Russia. Yet, during that very visit, talks were also held on two fundamental issues. First, it was then that a proposal to partition Ukraine is said to have been first put forward by Vladimir Putin to Donald Tusk. Second, this visit and the course of the talks with Putin was to be decisive with respect to the fate of the MDS to be deployed in Poland. For the Russian Federation, the missile defense system was a fundamental issue, and this is for a variety of reasons. The primary one was that places like this one, at which the Russians would store their nuclear weaponry in the Warsaw Pact countries, ceased to exist with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The construction of the MDMS and other American installations in this part of the world would have clearly proved that the empire had really collapsed, the Russian Federation having lost control over this area. Impressive indeed. A dummy of the nuclear warhead and a map of its projected use. Yes, indeed. It's a map of Operating Plan Number 1, dated 1965, providing for the use of the Polish People's Army as part of the seashore front meant to attack the Western world. The construction of this facility was part of the plan's update, so to say. According to the operating plan, the seashore front was to use 91 nuclear warheads in its attack on the west.
Front nadmorski miał użyć 91 głowic jądrowych do ataku na zachód.
Well, we have decided to meet in this place. It is somehow symbolic that a Soviet depot, meant once to be in a Soviet attack on the world, is located very near to the place where the Poles and the Americans were once bargaining on the construction of a missile defense system, designed to shoot down missiles carrying diverse warheads towards the civilized world.
Negocjowali przez bardzo długi czas budowę instalacji, która jest instalacją antyrakietową, mającą zestrzeliwać pociski noszące różnego rodzaju głowice w stronę cywilizowanego świata.
negocjacje polityczne między Polską a Stanami Zjednoczonymi bardzo mocno zintensyfikowane.
The political negotiations between Poland and the US highly intensified in 2007 and concluded with an agreement on the deployment of the MDS in Poland. Came as a real way out of a strategic time of troubles Poland faced after it joined NATO. There was, in fact, no security warranty in terms of the actual possibility to make use of Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. For Poland was quite fragile in military terms, unable to defend itself, be it for a couple of days in the event of getting attacked by an outside aggressor. The MDS offered an opportunity for Poland to not stay alone and to get a moment of breath, gain time to make a real leap in armament terms into the 21st century. So it was a matter of strategic oxygen offered to us by the Americans.
Pewien czasokres, w którym Polska będzie mogła dokonać autentycznego skoku zbrojeniowego do XXI wieku, tak naprawdę, więc była to po prostu kwestia, można powiedzieć, strategicznego tlenu, który nam podali Amerykanie.
Ricky Ellison is an American lobbyist who, in 2007, 2008 and 2009, tried to persuade Poland to have the MDS deployed in its territory. This is a system that goes all the way back to the time of President Ronald Reagan. It was shown to Gorbachev at the time, and it was undergoing first tests. This is the systems generation. Our country, the US, is now making an even better system called the NGI, New Generation Interceptor. This is interconnected with the missile defense potential, so many of the devices are capable of working even more efficiently. Poland would have received this next generation device and then would become capable of defending the entire continent given the range. Just like in America, where you can defend the continent against an Iranian missile. So that was the system that was initially meant to be put in. The Russians are frightful of our missile defense system. Why? Because it can eliminate their nuclear force if used. In space, there's kinetic energy and non-kinetic, directional energy. Look at how advanced we are. This will certainly destabilize the long prevalent dominance in the military sector aspect. We are not in the space. You're simply asking me why, and I'm only saying that already in Reagan's time they were afraid of the American or Western technology to be able to take this.
Że będziemy w stanie to zrobić.
However, the NDS was not the only issue of interest to both parties of the conversation, Vladimir Putin and Donald Tusk. These men talked about Ukraine as well, and the cast of the delegation's members was extremely interesting. The Polish party was joined by someone who shouldn't have been there, according to the documents. Zbigniew Jońca was a man whose background was quite interesting. Jońca was a communist security service officer trained for years to carry out Russia's interests from the position of a functionary of Polish secret services, formerly the security service, and after the transition, the intelligence agency. Shortly before the trip, or the arrival at the Kremlin, Jońca reportedly had cut Mr. Grabarczyk, a constitutional minister, out of the Polish team to hold talks with Putin. And then he acted as his replacement. When we take a look at the snapshots or footage from that meeting, Minister Grabarczyk cannot be spotted, as opposed to Colonel Jońca, an intelligence agency officer, but in fact an SB officer since the 1970s. He was initially headhunted as a personal source of information by the civil intelligence of Communist Poland when serving at the Polish embassy in Paris in 1973 to 1975. Then he was made a member of the official staff.
Później zostaje ukadrowiony Jest absolwentem rocznika 75-76.
Graduated in 75-76 from the Intelligent Human Resources Training Center in Kyokuti, he was seconded to the institutions which formerly had nothing to do with the secret services.
I najpierw to jest Ministerstwo Współpracy z zagranicą, Biuro Radcy Handlowego, gdzie
First, the Ministry of Foreign Cooperation Commercial Advisors Office.
później w Montrealu po roku 87
There, he worked at various posts, such as Brussels, and after 1987, Montreal. Then, after 1990, he functioned as a banker with a post-communist bank called Braybank, then with the Ministry of Economy till 1999. Then, he rejoined the Foreign Ministry, never ceasing to be a Secret Service officer.
cały czas jest
Initially, in 2001 to 2004, he worked for the Parliament representation of Poland to the European Union.
w latach 2001-2004 pracuje
After 2004, until autumn 2008, he worked in Moscow as an advisor, and then advisor minister plenipotentiary at the Polish embassy.
pracuje w Moskwie.
Importantly, during his term as operating officer with the security service, he took charge of two basic areas, or operating objects.
W swoim okresie, bym powiedział,
One was the Vatican Catholic Church. He would even manage the personal sources residing in the Vatican. For instance, he ran the affair of an information contact, codenamed Fermo.
czy szerzej Kościół katolicki. Rządca prowadzi nawet źródła osobowe usytuowane w Watykanie.
The nickname of the later Archbishop, Juliusz Patz.
Masyjnego kryptonim Fermo, czyli później
The other area of his interest was, interestingly in itself, the European Union,
zainteresowania, co jest
which actually was the European Economic Community at the time.
europejska.
There, he took care of tasks being part of a big object operation run by Department 1 of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, codename Treaty.
Pierwszego MSW o kryptonimie Traktat.
It is, you can say, a played-out cliché. Every officer who has been through Kyokuti and Department 1 was known to the Russians before 1991, and to the Soviets before that.
Po roku 91 wcześniej Sowietom.
To nigdy wcześniej
These are never before published photos from the intelligence center in Kyokuti. In the entire center's history, cameras have visited just a few times. Russia had complete control over the communist-era special services. So what was the point of sending an intelligence officer to Moscow who could have had no secrets from Russia?
Jako oficera wywiadu do Moskwy, człowieka, który przed Rosją nie miał, bo nie mógł mieć żadnych tajemnic.
To, że taka
The fact that he seems to have been one of the most important figures at the embassy there is extremely relevant to this whole ministerial puzzle and the role the embassy played in the concept of a political reset with Russia. Some accounts indicate that Zhońca actually managed the embassy operations.
wynika, że rządca faktycznie kierował placówką.
Why would Donald Tusk need a former communist Ministry of Public Security officer in his meeting with Vladimir Putin? A man Russians knew everything about that we don't. What we know, though, is that Zbigniew Zhońca witnessed the drafting of the official report covering the Putin-Tusk meeting.
Tak, i miał
Ambassador Barr was also said to have contributed. As I say, these are relational sources, and until we find the memo, which is said to have been sent to Warsaw via two channels, one being the Foreign Ministry and the other the intelligence services sent to the intelligence agency headquarters, we will be limited to relational sources only.
będziemy poruszali się
Diplomacy memos are way more than mere grocery shopping lists. They are the foundation on which foreign policy is built. A diplomatic memo is an official report of a meeting with the President, the Prime Minister, various diplomats or experts. It is information necessary to build the state's knowledge of what happened. We attempted to locate the official memo of the Tusk-Putin meeting, but the task proved more difficult than it might have seemed. We do not know what the contents of the memo sent from Moscow to the intelligence agency are in detail. Our informants claim that such memo exists and say that it differs significantly from what was passed on to the most important Polish officials. We know the contents of the official foreign ministry documents that have been produced on the issue, though. We learned it from a man well known to Russians. He's a graduate of MGIMO, Russia's forge of diplomatic and intelligence personnel. The document he has drafted proves that the issue surrounding the memo was the reason for the fight between the Foreign Ministry and Prime Minister Tusk's office.
Świadczy o tym, że sprawa dotycząca tej notatki była powodem awantury pomiędzy Ministerstwem Spraw Zagranicznych a kancelarią premiera Tuska.
Adresatem tego pisma jest minister spraw zagranicznych
The
Sikorski.
letter was originally sent to Foreign Minister Sikorski, and one may infer, as the letter openly states, that it concerns the untimely drafting of a briefing memo on the Prime Minister Tusk's visit to Moscow. It's an outright sensational document. That's because it describes the behind-the-scenes workings of Donald Tusk's diplomacy as related to Russia. It says no memo accounting of the visit has been drafted at the Foreign Ministry at all. Furthermore, it mentions that on February the 12th, a corresponding memo was drafted by the Foreign Policy Department of the Chancellery, i.e. the Prime Minister Tusk's office.
Departamencie Polityki Zagranicznej KPRM, czyli w kancelarii premiera Tuska.
According to information from the Chancellery, it appeared that it was the Prime Minister's office, whose many representatives made up the official delegation, that drew up the document. This is what the Polish embassy in Moscow also claimed, saying no one from the Chancellery had tasked them to draft the dispatches or the memo. By the way, after I learned I would not be included in the delegation, I asked the Deputy Director Lamparska of the Foreign Affairs Department of the Chancellery as to who drafted the memo of the visit. She responded the embassy would be tasked with that. As the relevant memo from the Chancellery had not shown up in spite of time going on, I asked the embassy to produce a draft report from the visit, so that at least the Department of Eastern Policies would have a basic grasp on what had happened there. That kind of confidential material was sent via a secure channel on the 12th of the month. I promptly forwarded it to the Minister and Ms. Bernatovich. However, the Department of Eastern Policies has still not received any formal request to write up a comprehensive memo on the Prime Minister's visit based on the incomplete materials and information. That shocked me, as diplomatic relations obviously require accounting of conversations in order to maintain continuity of documentation. Documentation also guarantees the transparency of the state's actions to its citizens. Certainly, some documents are secret, but in the future, one will be able to reconstruct the actions their own state has taken nonetheless. That guarantees the basic tenets of civic security in the first place. A missing memo covering such key conversations at such a crucial point in time during such an important visit, well, that's positively shocking. The letter shows that the Foreign Ministry was basically disregarded with. Poland's reset with Moscow and its implementation through the Prime Minister's visit format was decided by some inner circle, by no means those formally in charge of the foreign policy. Because if the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as this letter indicates, was almost completely excluded from meaningful participation, if the key departments directing Poland's eastern policy don't participate in a Prime Minister's visit, one that was prepared for so long, then something isn't right, is it? Something isn't right for the state itself.
Kierunkowe polityki wschodniej nie uczestniczą w wizycie premiera Polski tak bardzo, przecież to nie jest codzienna wizyta, tak?
Then, the Bratkiewicz letter also includes a clue to yet another document regarding the course of the Kremlin meeting. In February 2008, the document was classified. The security clearance was imposed by Radosław Sikorski himself. What's more, Radosław Sikorski removed the clearance a few days before he stepped down as foreign minister. But for years, he never mentioned publicly that a document like that had even existed. This is the first time it is being revealed to a broad public. Even though journalists have asked hundreds of questions to Radosław Sikorski about whether the memo has come to be, they never bothered to look for the document itself. Admittedly, it has not been drafted directly in Moscow, but much later, so it's not a classic memo like it should have been, but at least an attempt to develop the post-hoc knowledge. The document was signed by Radosław Sikorski, though it has two other authors referenced therein, and known very well to Moscow. Jarosław Bratkiewicz, an MGIMO graduate and head of the Eastern Department.
Są dwaj ludzie świetnie znani w Moskwie. Jarosław Bratkiewicz, absolwent MGIMO i szef Departamentu Wschodniego oraz wieloletni...
And Zbigniew Żońca, a long-time Communist Ministry of Public Security officer, who continued his career in special forces.
Oficjalna notatka
This is an official letter, an informative letter on the visit of the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk to Moscow on February the 8th, 2008.
w dniu 8 lutego 2008.
And someone could say, OK, so what's the point? After all, there is a document. Probably Jarosław Bratkiewicz wrote it, but it's here, at the MFA, with official stamps, and you can see everything's there.
Odbywają się na takim szczeblu, nie sporządza się
It's just that records of meetings held at such a high level are not to be drafted 2 weeks afterwards. The way things are done in diplomacy is to draft them promptly, as soon as possible, so that they reflect the actual course of the meeting, preferably on the very day the particular meeting covered by a memo has taken place.
miało miejsce.
And here, we've got a documented draft in Warsaw rather than in Moscow on February the 21st, 2008. That is, again, several days have passed since Donald Tusk's visit, and it is being recreated, as is evident from Bratkiewicz's document, his letter to Sikorski. It's being based on some account that was sent from Moscow on February the 12th after some internal wrangling. One so official as to have become borderline disinformative, with a very low restrictive clearance level, and listing Lech Kaczynski as the first addressee. My track record, knowledge and experience of working with materials produced by Polish diplomats of the Donald Tusk period until 2010 allow me to confidently state that those including President Lech Kaczynski as an addressee are different in character from those that do not.
Okresu Donalda Tuska do roku 2010 mogę jednoznacznie powiedzieć, że notatki, na których widnieje na rozdzielniku prezydent Lech Kaczyński, są inne niż te, na których jego nazwisko nie widnieje.
We need to remember that not long after the documents discussed here were drafted, the late Lech Kaczynski formulated his accurate diagnosis at the Tbilisi rally. This shows how Poland was capable of an accurate diagnosis of what was happening and what was about to happen in the region, what Putin's policy was leading towards. Now, more than a decade later, everybody says the same, often admitting they've been wrong before. But Warsaw had a realistic assessment of Russian policy back then already. At the time, it was centred around the late President Kaczynski, but many other experts must have known what was going on all the time too. During this meeting, a proposal was supposed to have been made, a Russian proposal for Poland's involvement in the partition of Ukraine, a proposal, the traces of which can be barely seen in the margins of the few documents that were drafted in the Polish Foreign Ministry under strange circumstances.
sporządzonej po długim czasie.
Does the memo, the official one, drafted after a long time, include any reference to this proposal that Vladimir Putin was supposed to have made to Donald Tusk to partition Ukraine?
Notatka podpisana przez Sikorskiego, a sporządzona przez
Of course it doesn't. The memo, signed by Sikorski and drafted by the Brakiewicz-Żońca duo, contains yet another puzzle. Its conclusion includes the following sentence. The talks in Moscow had a good and business-like atmosphere, though not one devoid of controversial and debatable parts.
Pracowali w Ministerstwie Spraw Zagranicznych
My informants, who, at the time in 2008, worked at the Polish Foreign Ministry, said, when reporting on the meeting between Prime Minister Donald Tusk and President Putin in the Kremlin on February the 8th, 2008, that shortly after the greetings, definitely during the first part of the conversation, Putin was said to have jokingly addressed Donald Tusk, saying he'd like to talk with him, with Poland, about the partition of Ukraine. We don't know how the Prime Minister reacted to that. I'm not claiming he approved. But certainly, President Putin put the Polish delegation and the Polish Prime Minister in a difficult situation. Probably not because of what their reaction was. But this issue, having emerged in the first place, probably caused the disappearance of 1, 2, or perhaps even 3 memos on the actual course of the meeting. Because revealing that kind of memo, filling it, forwarding a copy to Polish President Lech Kaczynski, all that would undermine the very idea behind what Tusk had called the new philosophy of Polish-Russian relations back in 2007 already. The reset would have been cancelled before it even took off. Because if the stakes of these new relations, the new philosophy of Russian-Polish relations, were to be some kind of cooperation between Poland and Russia in destroying Ukraine's independence, then the whole reset would not have made sense.
Na starcie reset zostałby unieważniony, no bo skoro stawką tych nowych relacji, nowej filozofii relacji w tym wymiarze rosyjsko-polskich miałaby jakaś być współpraca Polski z Rosją w zniszczeniu niepodległości Ukrainy, no to cały reset nie miałby sensu.
The authors did not elaborate. They did not mention any specifics of the controversies that emerged during the visit, which constituted a huge controversy on its own already. In retrospect, we know one of the most controversial issues about the visit. Good morning and welcome to a press briefing by the Speaker of the Sejm, Mr. Radosław Sikorski. To begin with, Mr. Speaker will present the highlights opening the... Have you heard in person the proposal Vladimir Putin made to Donald Tusk for a joint Polish-Russian partition of Ukraine? And if not, from whom? Has a case note been drafted on this? And thirdly, have the Polish President, our NATO allies and European Union partners been informed of the matter? I expected a question on this issue, but your question alone shows how complicated it is. I can say, in part, that I have not participated in this conversation, and since the issue concerns a press interview, you will find all the explanations of the misunderstandings that have arisen in the interview I have given to an online portal, to be released in about an hour. It is also not appropriate for us to wait for your interview that explains the previous interview. The matter is quite complicated, so I would very much appreciate your patience. Next question, please. Has a memo been drafted of the case in question, Mr. Speaker? Please refer to my interview. Does the Polish side have a recording of the conversation in question? Which conversation? The conversation you were talking about between Prime Minister Tusk and Mr. Putin. There is no recording. Mr. Speaker, is there a memo accounting for this conversation? Please refer to my interview. If there are no more questions, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of questions. It's like everybody's waiting for this interview. They've even told us. Exactly, so please refer to it. But it's your press conference. MP Grasz even told us that Donald Tusk may have a say on this after the press conference. So we'd like you to give us a specific information. What was said? When it was said? Were you surprised? How did you react? And first of all, was this interview, this conversation, followed up anyhow by a memo forward either to the President or to our allies? And how did he even react to that? And first of all, was this interview, this conversation, followed up by a memo forward either to the President or to our allies? And how did you even react to that? As the Foreign Minister in the Prime Minister Donald Tusk cabinet? That's my question. This is the account I heard, which could have been interpreted one way at the time, and whose meaning turned out to be different in the light of what has happened since. Could you elaborate on this, Mr. Speaker?
Rozmowę pomiędzy Putinem a Tuskiem, jaka odbyła się w Moskwie.
I'm elaborating on this in the text soon to be published. This preposterous press conference is Radosław Sikorski's attempt to explain himself after an interview he gave to the Politico website. In the interview, Sikorski gives an account of a conversation between Putin and Tusk that took place in Moscow on February the 8th, 2008. Since then, Russia has attempted to involve Poland in the invasion of Ukraine, just as if it were a postmodern rerun of the historic partitions of Poland. He wanted us to become participants in this partition of Ukraine, says Sikorski. Putin wants Poland to commit troops to Ukraine. These were the signals they sent us. We have known how they think for years. We have known that this is what they think for years. This was one of the first things that Putin said to my Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, soon to be the President of the European Council, when he visited Moscow. He went on to say that Ukraine is an artificial country and that Lvov is a Polish city, and why don't we just sort it out together? Luckily, Tusk didn't answer. He knew he was being recorded. The explaining went so poorly for Sikorski that he had to rerun the press conference. I wanted to sincerely apologise to you for the awkwardness this morning. I wanted to clarify that, in particular as a former journalist myself. I have never avoided contact with the media. The fact that I have limited my statement before was due to time constraints. Having learned from experience that unauthorised statements are radically misinterpreted, I wanted to give you the authorised content so that any doubts would be dispelled. But sometimes one overdoes things, and this was the case here. These explanations you've made in writing to a portal include a statement that you learned about what you said about Ukraine and its partition from accounts of others. In that case, let me ask, from whose accounts? What kind of accounts? What length? This is the first question of many, but of course, I will also give my colleagues. You know, I have made a firm resolution at this point to speak only about what I have heard myself with my own ears. I understand that the President's office was somehow notified of this general information, because even such general information is very significant for state security. Or was this simply treated as some kind of rumour? What was the attitude? As you said yourself, I was not involved in this conversation, so of course I did not notify anyone. Did you have access to any reports made of those talks at the time, as far as the talks of the Polish delegation in Moscow were concerned? Were you able to familiarise yourself with such documents? My memory has already failed me once. I do not want to make the same mistake again. But surely you must understand that no records are made of grim jokes. I understand that you are backing away from the statement that in 2008, during his press conference, Radosław Sikorski was trying his best not to acknowledge that such a document was kept by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, even though he had himself declassified it just a few weeks earlier. The journalist asked him questions directly. Still, he wouldn't say whether the memo existed or not. Why is it so? Was it so because the document drafted by Rządza and Brakiewicz and signed by Radosław Sikorski did not contain any information regarding the proposal to partition Ukraine made by Vladimir Putin to Donald Tusk? Or did Radosław Sikorski know that Tusk and Rządza drafted yet another document containing this information withheld from the President and the public, which was sent to the Foreign Intelligence Agency? Or was the sentence contained in the memo saying that Putin made controversial statements a covert trace that such a proposal indeed had been made? We don't know the answers to these questions. However, they can be found in the archives of the Foreign Intelligence Agency. It is not clear from the document what these controversial statements might mean. We can just guess their meaning considering that Radosław Sikorski kept mentioning Putin's proposal of a partition of Ukraine for years. He mentioned it in his interview given to Politico and also in his book. Moreover, some Polish politicians have been saying recently that by offering Ukraine Eastern Partnership and closer approximation towards the EU, we actually lured it into a trap, and that maybe we should have followed the suggestion made by Putin in Sopot, since Lvov had been made a Polish city anyway, and we could share our influence in Ukraine. Years later, Sikorski repeated different versions of the same story, including the following one presented in a radio interview in 2023. I hope that you can reflect when I said that Putin made strange suggestions and Zhirinovsky offered even a partition of Ukraine. You made a scandal out of it. Today, it turns out that Russians keep making us this offer. They keep referring to this argument in their propaganda. Years later, we learned from documents held in President George Bush's library and declassified by the US government that precisely the same statements, which had been withheld from the Polish public, were presented by Putin during his meeting with George Bush. The only difference is that in the case of the meeting between Putin and Bush, we don't need to guess it because the Office of the US President made a detailed report, a memorandum of conversation stating sentence by sentence what was said by the US President and Vladimir Putin.
Raport, stenogram, gdzie zdanie po zdaniu napisane jest, co powiedział prezydent Stanów Zjednoczonych i co powiedział Władimir Putin.
I'd like to emphasize that ascension to NATO of a country like Ukraine will create a field of conflict for our countries in the long term, a long-term confrontation. Why? 17 million Russians live in Ukraine. It's 1/3 of its population. Ukraine is a very complex country. It is not a nation built in a natural way. It is an artificial country created in the Soviet period. After World War II, Ukraine gained some of its territories from Poland, Romania and Hungary. It was actually all the western Ukraine. In the 1920s and 1930s, Ukraine gained some territories from Russia. It was the eastern part of the country. In 1956, Ukraine was given the Crimean Peninsula. According to our informants, it was around the time when Radosław Sikorski was declassifying the said documents and later giving the interview to Politico and holding his press conference that the Polish special services started searching for information on whether or not any trace of Vladimir Putin making a proposal to Donald Tusk on partitioning Ukraine could be found in the archives. The Polish politicians seeking such information were assured that Donald Tusk was safe in this regard, that there was no danger. At that time, Donald Tusk was embarking on his mission as President of the European Council.
Donald Tusk wówczas rozpoczynał właśnie swoją misję jako przewodniczący Rady Europejskiej.
The most important element of the document drafted by Jońca and Brakiewicz and signed by Radosław Sikorski is a description of the part of the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Tusk in which they talk about the missile defense system. The first sentence of the substantial part of the memo goes as follows. Vladimir Putin focused on issues related to the missile defense system. He made a proposal that 2 command centers be established, Brussels and Moscow, with the USA taking the leading role. In strong words, he demanded that the Russian side be given 24/7 access to the future bases of the MD system. At the same time, it became clear that he was convinced that the decision to build bases in Poland and the Czech Republic had already been made. He threatened that, if they were built, Russia would redirect some of its missiles to targets on Polish territory. I learned more about this visit and the conversation about the crucial topic, that is the missile defense system, from Radosław Sikorski's memoirs. He described an incredible scene in a very graphic way. Putin took a piece of paper and sketched out for Donald Tusk the extent of the proposed installation. Let's admit it, It was impressive, not only because Putin had excellent knowledge of the technical details, but also because the range of the guidance radar clearly included Russian territory. And never mind that the shootdown would occur in the stratosphere or even higher. The Russian president demanded that the radar's ability to operate over his country's territory be physically limited. This must have been described in a memo if Sikorski, years later, had such an exact recollection of that meeting. It must have made a great impression on those greenhorns, if you'll pardon my choice of words. It was a clash between a man who knew what he was talking about and some naive athletes, detached from reality, who had come to organise a reset. And here you go, such a blow, right from the start. The partition of Ukraine, the missile defence system threats. The Polish delegation was put against a wall, so to speak. The document shows clearly that the plan of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs had for this meeting blatantly differed from what actually happened. The Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs declared that Donald Tusk would talk about the new philosophy for Polish-Russian relations and waterway transport on the Vistula Lagoon. However, in reality, Putin and Tusk talked about hard interests, and specifically, as the first bullet point of the memo reads, about the missile defence system. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the press conference held to discuss today's visit.
Dłuższy czas rozmawialiśmy o tarczy antyrakietowej. Prezydent Putin
For quite some time, I talked with President Putin about the missile defence system. President Putin is not a fan of this project. I hope you can appreciate my mild choice of words. However, he acknowledged Poland's autonomous right to make its own decisions as to what and whose defence installations would be located on our territory, which is obvious. He openly said that he expected that Russia should be able to monitor, to check the missile defence system to make sure it would not be directed against Russia. We also know that the Americans would be willing to offer Russia such a sense of security by allowing for some kind of monitoring or inspection. We concluded that this topic would need to be further discussed.
Byliby skłonni dać tego typu poczucie bezpieczeństwa poprzez jakąś formę monitoringu czy inspekcji. Stwierdziliśmy, że to jest temat do rozmowy.
The Polish Prime Minister withheld from the public that during that meeting, Putin threatened Poland with Russian nuclear missiles being targeted at its territory. Despite this, Tusk considered the visit and the meeting to be beneficial for Poland. We all believe that from the perspective of the Polish interests, both Poland's and Russia's efforts to reinvigorate our exchange, have a more open and friendly dialogue, might have some good effects for both Poland and Russia. Unfreezing our relations will be beneficial. The visit paid by Donald Tusk in Moscow and his meeting with Vladimir Putin determined the whole policy that Donald Tusk will pursue over the following years. I believe that the outcome of these official meetings is a positive one. Donald Tusk's wishful thinking was in line with the recommendations made by the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs before the visit even took place, and explaining how it should be presented to the public for propaganda purposes. However, the memos drafted by the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs showed clearly that nothing would change as for unblocking trade with Russia with regard to both meat and other food products, including lifting the embargo on meat. This was communicated directly by Dmitry Medvedev, which we learned from the memo. As for lifting the Russian embargo on Polish food products, Dmitry Medvedev pointed out that Russia was seeking to reduce its dependence on food imports. He stressed that it was unacceptable that more than 80% of agricultural goods and shops and on the Russian market were imported. He indicated that he was personally responsible for the implementation of some social programs, one of which was to achieve self-sufficiency in many areas of the agri-food industry and culture. This can hardly be seen as anything else than a mockery of Poland. Poland just withdrawn its veto on trade talks between Russia and the EU. Just 1 month earlier, Donald Tusk had withdrawn Poland's veto on Russia, joining the OECD and, in consequence, the WTO. Also, he had just declared that Poland would no longer block the PCA2 negotiations, hoping that Russia would lift its embargo on Polish meat and other food products. In this matter, Poland was simply ridiculed, and not even by Putin, but by Dmitry Medvedev, who was then just a deputy prime minister. In a nutshell, the message was as follows. You withdraw your veto, you declare that you will no longer block our interests, you want us to talk well of you, and you can no longer do us any harm. So we will just go on keeping your products off our market. How was this part of the conversations presented to the Polish public just a moment later? The talks about increasing our trade, also with regard to agri-food products, and declarations that Russia would be willing to do all it can, or at least a great deal, so that lifting the embargo would in practice produce a better effect than we've seen so far. Radosław Sikorski flew from Moscow directly here to Munich to participate in the annual Munich Security Conference held at the Munich Hotel Bayerischer Hof. There is a place for cooperation with Moscow. We want to have Russia as our partner in this project. As soon as the plane carrying the Polish Prime Minister landed in Warsaw, it became clear that the proposals made by Poland or the US with regard to monitoring or inspecting the missile defense system by Russia did not matter at all. The threat that Russian nuclear missiles would be targeted at Poland, previously withheld from the public during the press conference, was revealed by Vladimir Putin himself. If systems are located in Poland, which, as we believe, will be aimed at neutralizing our missile defense system, disturbing in consequence the global balance of military power, or this will pose a threat to our national security, we will take countermeasures, targeting our missiles at objects posing a threat to us. This statement by Vladimir Putin resulted in obvious questions being asked as to the purpose, sense and efficiency of the declared approximation between Poland and Russia, the so-called new philosophy of bilateral relations which Donald Tusk presented to Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Pursuing a policy of unreflective subservience leads to nothing. It is wrong. It is naive. If it is not the result of some conditions that we are unaware of some element of coercion, and I hope it is not, then it should be reviewed as soon as possible. It was at the time that the negotiations on the missile defense system were entering a decisive phase. On the Polish side, these negotiations were conducted by Witold Waszczykowski, serving as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, both in the previous government, headed by Jarosław Kaczynski, and the government headed by Donald Tusk. In the early 2000s, there was a significant threat from Iran, which started a nuclear program and a missile program. The Americans recognized that if Iranian missiles were fired at the United States, they could fly over Central Europe, Northern Europe, the North Sea, and Canada. You need to picture what the globe looks like. Thus, there should be anti-missiles somewhere in the area between Poland, Lithuania, and the UK. We latched onto this because the American presence, presence of an American base to defend the US territory was a great opportunity to increase the security of Poland. After all, any installation that would defend the US would also be defended by the Americans. A significant part of Poland around the missile base would thus be covered not only by the NATO guarantees, which, as I said a moment ago, were incomplete, non-automatic, but also by the US defense plan. We would thus have an additional alliance with the US.
Ale mielibyśmy dodatkowy sojusz ze Stanami Zjednoczonymi i plan obrony Stanów Zjednoczonych, przynajmniej terytorium Polski.
Sprawa tarczy w tamtych latach, w zasadzie do dzisiaj, ale
Since May 2001, when George Bush put forward the idea of a missile defense system which could defend not only the US but also its European allies, there have been three fundamental issues for Russia, all of them closely related. The first issue is NATO enlargement. The second is the missile defense system. And the third is related to the first two, the expansion of areas of freedom to the east into the post-Soviet zone. Since 2001, the entire Russian diplomatic and intelligence axis, with a certain break related to combating terrorism, the September the 11th attacks, etc., has been aimed at overturning these three elements of the policy of the free world, the US. And really, wrestling around the missile defense system in Poland has been the most serious challenge faced by Polish diplomacy. And to sum up, it must be said right away that at a time when this project was not only being developed, but actually had a chance to be finalized, regardless of the fact that the Obama administration was to follow in 2009, Donald Tusk's diplomatic team, from the very beginning, tried to overturn this project, to drag it out, to discuss it in such a way that it could no longer fit into the political agenda of the Republican administration, i.e., until 2008.
W agendzie politycznej administracji republikanów, czyli do końca 2008 roku.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni, i wszystkie słowa
Dyplomatyczną grę przeciwko Stanom Zjednoczonym, przeciwko prezydentowi Bushowi i przeciwko amerykańskiej tarczy antyrakietowej premier Polski Donald Tusk rozpoczął miesiąc po wizycie w Moskwie, kiedy wsiadł w samolot i poleciał do Waszyngtonu na spotkanie z George'em Bushem.